This is a reading from the book entitled The Diary of Jesus by Jean Aulagnier. February 4th, Sunday, AD 29. Sunday. Andrew mentioned that this was the beginning of the Israelite month of Adar. Early spring scents filled the air of this small paradise. Jesus and most of the apostles gathered together at dawn. Judas was the only one missing. His strange character and odd behavior caused Jesus to be mournful and preoccupied. Judas never ceased puzzling his companions. They discovered that Judas had not slept at the house he was assigned. They did not wait for him and headed for Merom. Footnote: Merom may be found spelled as Meiron, Meiron, editor, and Giscala. They simply left a message for Judas with some people at the hamlet. Judas soon caught up to them. He again lied about his whereabouts. The real reason he was not there was that he had been with a prostitute. Jesus could read this sad truth directly in Judas's heart. They arrived in Merom late that morning, and the townspeople welcomed them enthusiastically. Jesus and his group left in the afternoon for the great rabbinical city of Giscala. The master wanted to pray at the tomb of the great Rabbi Hillel. Jesus and Judas walked together. Once again, the Messiah encouraged his apostle to humble himself and repent sincerely, since it is the only way to salvation. Again, Jesus spoke with Judas in vain. The city of Giscala was nothing like Merom. At first, the rabbis and their disciples made some rude remarks about Jesus. Jesus and his group went by and prayed by Hillel's tomb. This caused a violent dispute. The rabbis openly blamed Jesus. They began throwing rocks at him and at the apostles. Jesus was hit on the hand, James the Less on the temple, and Andrew on the leg. The Messiah, at a glance, miraculously paralyzed the crowd's escalating aggression against him. He shouted with a thunderous voice, "I am God's fountain. My coming is your undoing. I am the fountain of eternal life, but you do not want to drink, and you shall die." It was suddenly deadly silent. It was as if mankind and creation were paralyzed. Jesus left. Jesus and his apostles spent the night in a barn. February 5th, Monday. Jesus started evangelizing again in the mountainous area between Giscala and Kadesh. They were still suffering from their wounds. A poor family charitably welcomed them for the night. Jesus performed another healing in their hamlet. He healed a young man who was a deaf-mute. February 6th, Tuesday. The wounded men felt much better in the morning. Thanks be to God. Jesus and his apostles set off for Kadesh. The market was alive with traders when they arrived. They met ever-present Pharisees and Sadducees at the city square near the synagogue. Even some rabbis from Giscala came over, like bloodhounds on the heels of the Messiah. Jesus remained calm. He leaned on a wall and began preaching. An attentive crowd soon circled him. He said that the soul is the most holy of places, and that redemption was soon coming. The chief of the synagogue invited Jesus to finish his sermon in the magnificent place of worship of Kadesh. The faithful crowd tried to keep the hostile doctors of the law out of the way by the door, but some still managed to shout their venom. One rabbi haughtily demanded that Jesus raise a rotting dead body back to life. Then another one spoke up. Zadok, also called the Golden Scribe. He would never cease to harass Jesus from then on. Zadok referred to all the false messiahs who had been unmasked. He demanded that Jesus give a true sign that he was the Messiah. Jesus showed him his wounded hand and replied, "See this? This is a sign you made. It is a sign of another sign that will be carved into the flesh of the Lamb. You will exult then, but you will see it again when you give an account of your life before God's throne." As a result, there was a commotion. Jesus said, Matthew chapter 16, verse 2b, "When evening comes, you say, 'We are going to have fair weather, the sky is red.' Or at sunrise, 'There will be a storm today, the sky is red and lowering.' You know then how to read the face of the sky. Can you not read the signs of appointed times? It is a wicked and unfaithful generation that asks for a sign. The only sign that will be given it is the sign of the prophet Jonas." And so he went on his way and left them. Jesus left the synagogue by a side door, but the residents of Kadesh soon caught up to him. He was just about to eat at a small inn on the outlying district of town. Jesus spoke to them again, gave them his peace, and sent them away. After this, Jesus and his apostles left Kadesh. They walked until the moon set, that is, between 10 and 11 p.m., depending on the landscape. Footnote 5. Since this was 7 days after the new moon, the moon was still in its first quarter. February 7th, Wednesday. At the crack of dawn, they were on the road to Caesarea Philippi near Panias. This was the new capital of Philip the Tetrarch. Now they crossed the Jordan by boat. Matthew chapter 16, verse 5b. His disciples found that they had forgotten to take bread with them. So when Jesus said to them, "See that you have nothing to do with the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees," they thought he meant he had brought no bread. He meant they had brought no bread. Jesus knew it and said to them, "Men of little faith, what is this anxiety in your minds that you have brought no bread with you? Have you no wits even now? Or have you forgotten the 5,000 and their 5 loaves, and the number of baskets you filled? How could you suppose that I was thinking of bread when I said, 'Have nothing to do with the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees'?" Then they understood that his warning was against the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees, not against leavened bread. Jesus went on to say, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "The best say that you are Jesus, the Messiah. Others say you are a prophet. Others, just a rabbi. And all the others, as you know, say you are crazy or demon-possessed." Jesus insisted. Matthew chapter 16, verse 13b. "What do men say of the Son of Man? Who do they think he is?" "Some say John the Baptist," they told him. "Others Elijah. Others again Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Jesus said to them, "What about you? Who do you say that I am?" Then Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. It is not flesh and blood. It is my Father in heaven who has revealed this to you. And I tell you this in my turn, that you are Peter, which means rock, and it is upon this rock that I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he added, "From now on, Peter, you are their chief. They owe you obedience and respect, as to another me." And Jesus turned to the others and said, "And I proclaim this in front of all of you." A shower of reproaches would have had no greater emotional impact on Peter. He threw himself on Jesus' chest and sobbed. Excuse me. The pontiff of Christ's church was very weak then. Before entering Caesarea, the master, Matthew chapter 16, verse 20b, strictly forbade them to tell any man that he, Jesus, was the Christ. Let God speak in people's hearts as he speaks in yours. He said, yes, there will be people who listen to my words or yours with perfect faith and perfect love. These will manage to understand by themselves the true meaning of the words Jesus Christ, the Word, the Son of Man, the Son of God. The apostles started looking for the disciples when they entered the city. They found several of them immediately. The best known among them were Benjamin, Daniel, Abel, Hermasti, and Isaac. Others had been waiting for Jesus too, some residents of Kadesh, and some residents of the hamlet where Jesus had healed a person who was deaf-mute. See February 5th. They all seemed perfectly happy. They did not need to hide themselves, since Philip the Tetrarch had nothing against Jesus. Besides, Philip was happy to tease his brother Antipas, who did not like rabbis. They walked together to the home that was to welcome Jesus. There the people from Kadesh asked him about what he had said the day before. Jesus explained the sign of Jonah to them. After the 3 days were over, Nineveh repented, but that will not be the case with Jerusalem. Yet I will give all the necessary signs. A dead, rotting body will be brought back to life again and be whole. Another body will rise by itself, since its spirit has been given all power. Footnote 6. Jesus was foretelling both the raising of Lazarus and his own resurrection. Editor. These will be signs of faith and salvation for those who believe, and eternal death for malicious non-believers. Since their old host knew the steward at the citadel, they all went there after the meal. The view was magnificent, and Jesus had the opportunity to perform another miracle. He brought a stillborn baby back to life. The father was dead, and Dorcas, the mournful mother, was only 17. Now this happened on Adar 5. Footnote 7. The purification had to take place 40 days later. This would be Nisan 15, the day of Passover, and the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It follows that purification could not take place on that day. We shall see on page 175 how this kind of problem was resolved. Right now we're on page 160. February 8th, Thursday. Jesus and his apostles were already halfway between Caesarea and Lake Hula by the time the sun was high. They were not the only ones going to Jerusalem, even though Passover was still over a month away. They stopped at noon, and Jesus spoke about his mother. He said that she was the Son of God's mother and was to be his co-redemptrix. He said that she would suffer greatly as a result of his suffering. The Savior, Matthew chapter 16, verse 21b, from that time onwards began to make it known to his disciples that he had to go to Jerusalem, and there, with much ill treatment from the chief priests and elders and scribes, had to be put to death, and rise again on the third day. Peter, drawing him to his side, began remonstrating with him. "Never, Lord," he said, "no such thing will happen to you." But Jesus turned round and said to Peter, "Back, Satan, you are a tripping stone in my path. These thoughts of yours are man's, not God's." Poor Peter felt crushed and remained speechless. No one dared speak. It did not take long, though, before Andrew could bear it no longer. He asked the Messiah to forgive his brother Peter. Jesus immediately softened his approach and called Peter at his side. He very lovingly reminded him that he was the first among the apostles and that this implied immense duties. Then he talked for the benefit of all. Matthew chapter 16, verse 24b. If any man has a mind to come my way, let him renounce himself and take up his cross and follow me. The man who tries to save his life shall lose it. It is the man who loses his life for my sake that will secure it. How is the man the better for it if he gains the whole world at the cost of losing his own soul? For a man's soul, what price can be high enough? The Son of Man will come in his Father's glory with his angels about him, and he will reward everyone then according to his works. Believe me, there are some of you standing here who will not taste of death before they have seen the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Since they were all eager to be with their families, they walked part of the night. February 9th, Friday. They reached Bethsaida by daybreak. It was touching to see Peter and Margim greet one another. Upon seeing this, Jesus delicately told them what their love would be like when they joined him in the next life. He also predicted that all his apostles, except one, as we know, would die dressed in the purple of martyrdom. Mark chapter 8, verse 22a. So they came to Bethsaida. Peter, Hermas, Stephen, John the priest, John the scribe, and many other disciples. Mark chapter 8, verse 22b. Brought a blind man to Jesus and entreated him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. Then he put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him and asked him if he could see anything. He looked up and said, "I can see men as if they were trees, but walking." Once more Jesus laid his hands on his eyes, and he began to see right. And soon he recovered, so that he could see everything clearly. Then Jesus sent him back to his house. "Go home," he said, "and if you should enter the village, do not tell anyone of it, because I do not wish to see a crowd gather right now." February 11th, Sunday. They all went to Capernaum. Manaen and the Judean shepherds were waiting for them. Manaen said that Jesus' renown was spreading rapidly, and that Herod's court was growing afraid of this. Manaen and the others had to come escort Jesus and the women on their way to Jerusalem for the Passover. Jesus accepted their offer, not for himself, of course, but for the women's sake. Then they visited Magdala. The poor were happy to greet the rabbi. February 12th, Monday. They arrived in Tiberias. Johanna put one of Cusa's carriages at the women's disposal. All the women from Bethsaida were going to be part of the journey. Porphyria, Salome, Nathanael's wife, and Philip's wife and his 2 daughters. Johanna joined them with the 2 children. They rode through Cana, and Susanna and her husband joined them. February 13th, Tuesday. They stopped in Nazareth. Once again, Jesus told all of them what made his mother Mary a model for the human race. February 14th, Wednesday. Matthew chapter 17, 1a. 6 days after. Jesus said to Peter, "Back, Satan." Matthew chapter 16, verse 23. Jesus took his apostles and disciples to Mount Tabor. He told everyone to scatter throughout the area in order to preach about the Lord until the evening. But, Matthew chapter 17, verse 1b. He took Peter and James and his brother John with him and led them up onto a high mountain where they were alone. Peter asked, "What are we going up there for?" Jesus replied, "I'm going to unite with my Father, and I wanted to take you along because I love you." It was a very nice day. The lake of Kinnereth looked like a piece of sky embedded in the greenery. The three apostles rested once they reached the top of the mountain. Christ went off by himself to a spot in the shade. He knelt down on the grass and leaned his forehead and one of his hands on a rock. The apostles rested comfortably on the grass and started to fall asleep. Then a brilliant light startled them. They saw that Jesus, Matthew chapter 17, verse 2, was transfigured in their presence. His face was shining like the sun, and his garments became white as snow. And all at once they saw Moses and Elijah talking with him. The three apostles fell on their knees, put their hands over their faces, and trembled for fear. After a while, Peter said aloud to Jesus, "Lord, it is well that we should be here. If it please you, let us make 3 huts in this place, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Jesus turned, smiled, and looked at them lovingly. Moses and Elijah did likewise. The apostles felt intimidated and kept quiet. 5b. Then a shining cloud overshadowed them, and now there was a voice which said to them out of the cloud, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him, then." The disciples, when they heard it, fell on their faces, overcome with fear. But Jesus came near and touched them. "Arise," he said. "Do not be afraid." They lifted up their eyes and saw no one there but Jesus only. And as they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus warned them, "Do not tell anybody of what you have seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." They asked him, "Why then is it that the scribes say Elijah must come before Christ?" He answered, "I tell you this, that Elijah has already come. He has prepared the way of the Lord, but those who teach revelation do not know it well. They cannot see the signs of the times, nor recognize those whom God has sent. Elijah has come back at a first time, and will come back again in the end times. Today he has come to prepare the church of Christ." Matthew chapter 17, verse 12b. But men did not recognize him. Instead, they misused him at their pleasure. That is, they killed him, just as the Son of Man is to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he had been speaking to them of John the Baptist. While they climbed down the mountain, the apostles kept their heads bowed deep in thought. They were saddened. They stopped halfway down, and Peter put his thoughts into words. "Why did you do that?" he asked. "Why did you say that? Your last words dispelled the joy from our hearts. And why did you bring just the 3 of us?" The Lord replied, "To strengthen you, for now and always. Now you know what I will be like after I die. You will remember this, and you shall tell about it when the time comes." Now there was a crowd at the foot of Mount Tabor, gathered round the apostles who had been left behind with the disciples. Matthew chapter 17, verse 14. When Jesus, Peter, James, and John reached the crowd, a man came up and knelt before him. "Lord," he said, "have pity on my son. He is a lunatic. He suffers a lot. He often throws himself into the fire and often into water. I brought him here to your disciples, but they could not cure him." Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how long must I be with you? How long must I bear with you?" These words were meant for Satan's hordes of devils who afflict and even possess people. Jesus went on to say, Matthew chapter 17, verse 16b, "Bring the boy here before me." And Jesus checked the devil with a word, and it came out of the boy, and from that hour he was cured. Jesus and his followers were gathered again in Nazareth as night fell. The moon was still full, but was not yet out. They lit a little lamp. Since it was too warm for winter, there would have to be rain soon. Jesus commented on the miracle he had performed that day. The child was tormented in his flesh by Satan. He was ill, but not possessed. His soul was pure. So I gladly freed him from the devil who sought to make his soul impure. Judas said, "But then, if it was just a disease," Matthew chapter 17, verse 18b, "why was it that we could not cast it out?" Jesus said to them, "Because you had no faith." Because what you really wanted was your own glory. Besides, Matthew chapter 17, verse 20, there is no way of casting out such spirits as this except by prayer and fasting. That verse is mysteriously absent in some versions of the gospel, and I wonder why. February 15th, Thursday. By dawn, Jesus and the 12 were already on the road to Cana. Manaen, Alphaeus of Sarah, and Jesus' cousin Simon went along with the shepherd disciples. They were going to accompany the women disciples and margin on their trip to Jerusalem for the Passover. Jesus advised them to go through Esdraelon. In this way they could give alms to Doris' servants, and Margim could see his grandfather. Then they would all meet in Bethany for the first of Nisan, give or take a few days. Jesus and his apostles went as far as Tiberias, where they spent the night. February 16th, Friday. They rented boats and crossed over to Capernaum. They had hardly set foot on the shore when, Matthew 17, verse 23b, the collectors of the temple tax approached Peter. "Does not your master pay the temple tax?" they asked. "Yes," he said. Soon afterwards, he came into the house, and Jesus forestalled him. "Simon," he said, "tell us what you think. Who do earthly kings impose customs and taxes on their own sons or on strangers?" "On strangers," Peter told him. And Jesus said to him, "Why then the children go free? But we will not hurt their consciences. Go down to the sea and cast your hook. Take out the first fish you draw up, and open its mouth. You will find a silver coin there. Take it and give it to them for me and for yourself. Then bring the fish back. We will fry it, and Thomas, their host, will charitably give us some bread." Peter immediately obeyed, and everything happened as Jesus had said. In the afternoon, Zebedee and Peter's brother-in-law brought them by boat to Magdala. Then Jesus and his apostles let the two fishermen go, and went to visit someone who was dying. After this, they walked back to Capernaum. The sun was setting in all its glory. They talked about the healing of the dying man. He had been at some time a fervent admirer of Mary of Magdala, and now the example of her conversion had led to his conversion. He also gave them a large amount of money for the poor. The group of disciples welcomed them into Capernaum. These disciples were evangelizing in the area. Jesus, as usual, was walking a few steps ahead of them. He was heading for Thomas's house. A boy, 7 or 8 years old, grabbed his hand and asked him for a nice parable. The boy said that every time Jesus preached, he remembered his parables and would repeat them to himself when he went to bed. Jesus beamed with joy. What a testimony of love. Meanwhile, his apostles, who were behind him, had been comparing each other's merits and rights. Jesus heard them and stopped. He said, "See this child? He is closer to truth than you are. His key to unlock the gate of my kingdom is his innocence. So be simple, humble, and filled with love." Matthew chapter 18, 3b. Believe me, unless you be converted and become like little children again, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. The greatest in the kingdom of heaven will be the ones who humble themselves like this little child. They all gathered on the shore after the meal. They sat down in a circle around an upturned boat. Jesus sat on the boat, and a few lamps shed some light. The Messiah began to speak. "Soon we will part, even though I still have many things to tell you. I have overheard you today. Your discussion was not always charitable. You all have a nail sticking in your heart. You are anxious to know if you will be among the first in the kingdom of heaven. That is dangerous. Your master is not a fraud, so do not ask me those kinds of things. Man cannot rule his life by himself. God alone can help man, if man has faith in God. There's only one way for this to happen. Pray to your Father and Lord. Prayer alone can turn punishment into a blessing. Let children give you the example. and love them for it. Matthew chapter 18, verse 5. He who welcomes such a child as this in my name gives welcome to me. And if anyone hurts the conscience of one of these little ones that believe in me, he had better have been drowned in the depths of the sea, with a millstone hung about his neck. Woe to the world for the hurt done to consciences. It is unavoidable that such hurt should come, but woe to the man through whom it comes. If your hand or your foot is an occasion of falling to you, cut it off and cast it away from you. Better for you to enter into life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet when you are cast into eternal fire. And if your eye is an occasion of falling to you, pluck it out and cast it away from you. Better for you to enter into life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes when you are cast into the fires of hell. Be patient and pay attention. The devil never says, now it is time to rest. February 17th and 18th. Jesus and his apostles left at night for some hills east of the Sea of Tiberias. They were going to preach God's word in some hamlets there. February 20th, Tuesday. Jesus was being followed by a crowd that was becoming larger and larger. February 22nd, Thursday, in the daytime. Matthew chapter 15, verse 32. Jesus called his disciples and said, I am moved with pity for the crowd. It is 3 days now since they have been with me, and they have nothing to eat. I must not send them away fasting, or perhaps they will grow faint on their journey. His disciples said to him, Where could we find loaves enough in a desert to feed such a great crowd? And Jesus asked them, How many loaves do you have? 7, they said, and a few small fishes. At that, he commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and the fishes with them, and when he had blessed and broken, he gave these to his disciples, and his disciples gave them to the crowd, and they all ate and had enough. Then they took up what was left of the broken pieces, 7 hampers full. 4,000 men had eaten, not reckoning women and children. And so, taking leave of the crowd, he went on board the ship and crossed to the region of Magdala. February 23rd, Friday. John chapter 6, verse 23. Other boats from Tiberias had put in near the place where they ate the loaves when the Lord gave thanks over them. But the crowd found neither Jesus nor his disciples there. So they took shipping and went back to Capernaum to look for Jesus. The disciples did not know where Jesus was, except that he had left by boat with the apostles, heading toward the east shore. They had left at night, right after the Sabbath, and were expected back that very evening. Stephen was among these disciples. Jesus had said to Stephen that he was the disciple who most resembled him spiritually. He had the honor of being the first martyr of Christ's church. See the book of Acts, chapter 6, verse 8 to chapter 7, verse 60. The crowd headed for Thomas's house and found Jesus standing on the threshold. John chapter 6, 25b. They asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? He had just arrived. With infinite goodness, Jesus greeted Stephen and blessed him. He then went to Capernaum's beautiful synagogue, which was so familiar to him. This is when he made a long, demanding sermon on the bread come down from heaven. And I'll read that next time.